Love China, hate China, or just curious about China? Hi everyone, 大家好. I'm super excited to share a conversation I had with Ken Wilcox, former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank and the author of the China Business Conundrum. Ensure that win-win doesn't mean Western companies lose twice. Listen to Ken's firsthand trials and tribulations trying to set up a joint venture in China between SVB and the CCP. His experiences are fascinating and sometimes maddening, filled with unexpected assertions from Chinese counterparts right out of the Art of War playbook, highlighting key cultural differences and, as Ken puts it, convoluted negotiation styles that expose Western naivety regarding doing business in China. No one in China has read the book Getting the Yes, so if you're armed with these tactics and strategies, you will fail. I want to start in 2008. And as you know, and as you summarized in the introduction of your book, there was a global financial crisis. And also, this is when I think this is when the Western world really started to get an introduction to what China would eventually become. And that was through the Beijing Summer Olympics. You were on the San Francisco Board of Directors for the Federal Reserve in that year, and you also attended a celebration in Shanghai as the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. So I just want to kind of paint a macro from
that makes good sense.
From 2008 to where we are today. So my question basically is, what were your perceptions of China then compared to the reality that you've come to know today after your experience in China?
Well, I would say that in 2008, I was filled with hope and optimism.
And has that changed?
Pardon me?
Has that optimism faded?
A little bit, yes.
Okay.
I was filled with hope and optimism relative to the possibility of establishing a really good relationship with the powers that be in China. And not just between our bank and China, but also I felt that the US and China were moving slowly in the direction of becoming better friends. I will say, though, that 2008 was the first jarring experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you why. In 2008, I got lectured a couple of different times by people that were fairly influential in China, not at the top, but in the middle, so to speak, about their faith in our ability, not SVB, but the US's ability to be a good partner. I think it really shook them that we failed so miserably as a country in 2008. They saw that as a really bad sign. And many people said, if this is the way your economy is going to behave, maybe we shouldn't be trying to work so closely with you. Maybe you're not somebody that we should emulate.
Okay, before we dig deeper on that, can you qualify? You got lectured by foreigners who are experienced in China, or you got lectured by Chinese counterparts in China?
These communist Chinese counterparties, definitely.
Okay, so you were lectured by Chinese people.
Yes, exactly.
So that's very interesting. So was this before was it before the economic downturn or after or during?
During.
It was during.
It was during. Yeah.
Okay. And so I guess a great question would be, is in hindsight, were the lectures justified? And were there any merit to the lectures?
I actually don't think the lectures were justified. And even if they were, I don't think that I believe in retrospect that the lectures had a different purpose.
Okay.
And I don't think that the purpose was what it purported to be. It purported to be an indication that they no longer felt that they should be emulating us, that they should be moving in the direction of open markets.
Okay.
But
okay.
But I don't think that that was actually the case. In other words, I don't think that they were ever emulating us or believing that they were emulating us. And I don't think that they were ever moving in the direction of open markets.
They were pretending.
Yeah, I think they were pretending. And I think that a technique that the Chinese Communist Party uses often in dealing with outsiders is shaming.
Okay.
And so I think the disappointment was real, but the way it was expressed was feigned, I believe.
So what do you think their real purpose was back in 2008? And is it your understanding that since it's the Communist Party of China, their purpose hasn't changed?
Yeah, well, I think their purpose was, and this may sound a little far-fetched, but in retrospect, I believe it was the case. I think their purpose was, when you shame somebody else, you make them feel uncomfortable. And to the extent that they might feel that they had an obligation to treat you better, it would bring it out. In other words, if I said to Eugene, you really have disappointed me. I'm not sure that I admire you to the extent that I used to.
Mm-hmm.
You could either get angry and walk away. That's one possibility. Or you could feel terrible about yourself and you could resolve to do a better job of pleasing me.
Did you feel that your China counterparts back in 2008, when they were giving you these lectures, do you feel they were shaming you personally or just expressing their dissatisfaction with the country that you come from?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. And I think that one of the techniques that the Chinese Communist Party invariably uses with foreigners is to try to make them feel bad and as if they have an obligation to do a better job.
Oh, kind of like, almost like trying to guilt you as a representative from the United States on their history of, being treated unequally, and now it's your turn to kind of pay them back or something like that.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That's well put. It's kind of guilting me in the hope that I will strive even more to please them.
Yeah, so there's so many threads about this. So I guess context is really important. And I always put it in the context of, let's say, just bargaining power or Porter's five forces. So back in 2008, obviously China as a country and businesses in China didn't have as much relative bargaining power as they might today.
Oh, that's definitely the case.
So they were using this as a strategy. How, given that they have less bargaining power than their Western counterparts?
I think that's right. Although I think that those were still early days in terms of our relationship with China, ours being SVB's relationship with China.
Mm-hmm. When you say the ones people who lectured you, because you break it down into, you have the Chinese Communist Party, you have Chinese culture, you have a trio of things that you say are important. Who were the people that were actually lecturing you? Was it the Chinese government? Was it the CCP? Or was it just your business counterparts?
It was business counterparts, but they would fit into the category of what I would call red hats, meaning these were relatively high-level business partners who did their absolute best to develop a good relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And Whether they were actually members of the party or not, I'm not 100% clear. But they definitely did their best to please the Chinese Communist Party and to act in accordance with what they perceived to be the party's desire.
How much Chinese did you speak when you first arrived in China?
Oh, very little,
Very little.
little. When I was about a year before we moved to China, we started taking Chinese lessons, but
Okay.
we weren't taking them in a very intense way. We were only having one lesson a week, so we had about 50 lessons before we went to China.
Mm-hmm.
Once we got to China, at the beginning of 2011, we started taking lessons every single day. And my study routine evolved in a way that became more and more intense over time. But within a couple of months, I was studying Chinese 3 hours a day, one of them with a tutor.
Now, this is an interesting question that you probably didn't get asked before. Were your Chinese lessons, did you find your teachers yourself, or was it recommended by one of your counterparts? Where to learn Chinese and from who?
No, I don't. I guess we found them ourselves because it was somebody in our office there. We had established an office already in 2005. It was a small office with only about 10, 12 people in it. Mm-hmm. But people in the office located our tutors.
I see.
Ultimately located our driver as well. So it's unclear to me who picked them.
And how aware were the main people who could actually have influence over the success or failure of your business venture in China? How aware were they that you were taking the time, 3 hours a day, to practice and try to learn Mandarin?
I think they were completely aware, and they were encouraging as well. They said that it was a good idea. And I actually was making, I think, reasonably good progress, given how difficult it is for somebody who grows up speaking English to learn to speak Chinese, particularly that late in life, because I was already almost 60, I think, when I started these lessons. And as I say, I did it ultimately over time. I did that for 8 years, 3 hours a day, 7 days a week.
For 8 years?
Yeah, 8 years. During the 4 years in China, and then the subsequent 4 years back here in California, I continued my lessons on Zoom with the same Chinese teacher. And I continued submitting myself to the testing program that the government endorses. And by the end of my 8 years, I tested out as being fundamentally, I guess, about a 10 or 11-year-old.
And so you've stopped your lessons now?
I did stop my lessons. I stopped my lessons in, let me think now, 2019.
2019. So I'll just share an interesting story. My mom, I grew up in Atlanta. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. And my mom used to teach Chinese. But
really?
Yes, not online, but just to, people in the local community and stuff like that.
Sure.
And she'd been doing that for essentially 30 years.
Wow.
And then eventually they retired, and then they wanted to move someplace more comfortable, so moved to California. My mom's student, one of her students, was 93.
Oh my God.
He had been taking lessons from her for 20 years, and it was almost like such a disappointment that, because there was no online classes then. It was all, he would drive to our house, and she would teach a group of like 3 or 4 people Mandarin Chinese every week. And the last class ended, it was almost kind of sad, but he was learning Chinese up until 93, and he would have kept on going had my mom not moved to California.
Oh, he must have been really saddened by her move.
He was, and he was learning it not because he was a business person, but just because he had an interest in, learning the language, learning the culture, and being able to communicate with Chinese people. And
well, that was my goal too. I really enjoyed my teacher. I liked her a lot. I really enjoyed learning Chinese. And I really enjoyed learning more about the culture, which you do ultimately if you're studying the language. So it was a very valuable experience. I wouldn't give it up for anything.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to talk a little bit more about Chinese culture. So you mentioned Chinese culture is one of the three pillars of things that you really need to understand if you want to create a success in China, however you define success. How much have you discovered learning Chinese helps or hurts your ability to understand the culture? Because sometimes what I've discovered is some things in English don't have direct Chinese translations and vice versa.
Oh, that's absolutely the case. The two languages are so different, but then the two cultures are so different too. I'm not sure that learning the language is essential to learning about the culture. But I do think that if you don't have strong support on the language front, it will be very difficult to learn about the culture. And when I say strong support, this is what I mean. Ultimately, I reached the point where I could express myself well enough that people understood what I was driving at. And I was actually able to write letters in Chinese, and I was to government officials, and I was actually able to give short speeches. However, there are a couple of caveats there. One of them is that even though I gave short speeches, people invariably, when I say short, I mean maybe 10 minutes, extemporaneously, in Chinese, people would come up to me afterwards and they would say things like, "Oh, your Chinese is so great. That's just wonderful." And then they'd say, "Last time I heard you do something like this, I didn't understand it, but today I did." But they kept saying that time after time after time. And however, I never was able to use my Chinese in a business setting. It just wasn't good enough. My speaking I could have scraped by with my speaking, but my listening comprehension was the one skill that I never was able to master. And the problem for an English speaker is number one, the tones. There are 4 tones, as you know, in Mandarin. And then the other problem is that we have in English something like 12,000 discrete sounds that carry meaning.
Okay.
Mandarin Chinese are only 400.
Oh.
You multiply them by 4, because each one could have a different tone, one of 4 tones. That's 1,600. So the problem ends up being that a lot of sounds in Chinese have to carry as many as 40 or 50 different meanings. Depends on the tone and it depends on the context. So it's very, very difficult to keep up with a conversation, because while your brain, no matter how fast it works, is trying to identify which one of the 50 possible meanings that person meant when they uttered a sound, they're already a paragraph ahead of you in their speaking. So that's very hard. But what I ended up doing was I ended up conducting my meetings with me speaking English, and I always had 2 translators with me, and they were always the same 2. And they were people that I really trusted, and they're great people. I really enjoyed them. They took turns. One would actually do the translating, and the other one would take notes. And afterwards, we'd have a discussion over what the people I was talking to really meant.
Were these translators found by you in your organization, or were they assigned?
No, they weren't assigned to me. I got them myself.
Okay.
And they were people that I very carefully picked. because I felt an intuitive connection to them. And
I have another question. So when they were providing you the interpretations or the translations, did they give you two versions? For example, they say, literally translated, this is what he said, but this is actually what he meant.
yes, exactly. Exactly. And you know what got me started in that direction, why I decided to do that, was that about 4 or 5 months into it, one of the two translators, who happened to be my assistant, my administrative assistant,
Mm-hmm.
we got really upset with me one day. She said to me one day, and again, this is only 5 months into our first year, she said, "Ken, you're never going to be successful in China."
Your assistant said that.
And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because you always say what you mean and you mean what you say. We don't do that in China."
That's exactly right. You know, when I talk to people for the first time who are trying to understand Chinese culture and how they communicate, the first thing I say is, you have to assume that Chinese people don't mean what they say or say what they mean, but not in a negative way.
That's right. It's not a negative thing necessarily at all.
Because most Westerners will think, well, Chinese people are disingenuous, they're liars, they don't ever talk the truth, but that's just how they communicate.
Yeah, right. I agree with that assessment totally.
I have another question regarding your Chinese language learning. You know, I'm not a Chinese teacher, but I do teach some Chinese language through culture. And I once trademarked the phrase, learning how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. Now, this is how I would gauge your Chinese proficiency. Have you ever discovered, like if you're trying to say something in Chinese to somebody else, have you ever discovered that you know what you want to say in English and you know what you mean, but when you say it in Chinese, you have to change what you say and change what you mean in order to communicate your point?
That's absolutely the case. Yeah, that is for sure.
Okay.
That is for sure. So I think that the main thing I got out of learning Chinese, and when I say learning Chinese, I'm exaggerating a little because, as I say, I tested out as a 10 or 11-year-old after all those years, was number one, all other factors being equal, people tended to appreciate it. People felt that I was really trying, that I respected them and their language.
Yes.
And they found it endearing.
Yes.
Even government officials, even high-level members of the Chinese Communist Party, I think at some level, at a sort of a human level, they appreciated it.
Okay. So this is great background. I really want to talk about a little bit more about the book, the China Business Conundrum. And I really want to get into what you refer to the book as a form of inadvertent technology transfer. And my first question is how do you believe or think when I say Americans or Westerners, our collective naivety has changed since 2008? Because obviously the general perception of at least Chinese people is when an American comes over here, they're very naive about how things actually work. And we can do all sorts of things to manipulate them and get what we want. So how do you believe our collective naivety has changed now that we are so paranoid about China? And what are the remedies to prevent what you refer to as inadvertent technology transfer?
Right. So let me take a minute and describe what I mean by inadvertent technology transfer first, and then I'll come back to your question.
All right.
But generally speaking, my experience in China is somewhat indicative of other people's, meaning as I've gone on my book tour in these past few months and given a lot of different presentations, many people have come up to me afterwards and said, you know, I'm so glad you said what you said, because it's exactly the experience that I had when I was doing business in China. but I never really talked about it. I didn't write about it and I didn't speak about it. And they admit that for two different reasons. One is they felt foolish because they had been so naive and had gotten taken to the cleaners, so to speak, so often. And the other thing was that they were worried about the Chinese Communist Party trying to get even with their company.
Yeah, getting put on a list.
Pardon me?
They were worried about getting put on a list.
That's right. That's exactly right. So fundamentally, here's what happened to us in China. I'm just going to hit on three main points, and that'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Early on, about 2 years before my wife and I actually moved to China, I was introduced to a guy named Yu Zhengsheng, and he was at the time the party secretary of Shanghai. That's a huge position in the party. And later, he was elevated when Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. He was elevated to the standing committee. So he was fundamentally one of the 7 most powerful people in China. So 2009, 2010, he met with me 3 or 4, maybe even 5 times. And here's what he said. He said, Ken, we have scoured the universe and we've been looking for the best bank to help us develop the technology sector because we really don't know how to finance technology. We have identified your bank and we want you here. And your bank is the best in the world at doing this. And then he even said, better than Goldman Sachs, and better than Morgan Stanley. And then he went so far as to say, and Ken, you're one of the smartest Americans I've ever met, because you really get China. And I thought, of course, he's playing me, but I kind of halfway enjoy it. And it does suggest that I'm moving in the direction I want to move, which is to get a banking license in China.
Right.
That's step one. And what I have learned in retrospect is that many, many other companies have had the same experience.
Right.
So that's number one. Number two, and I'm just going to hit on 3 main events. Number 2 was the day we actually got the license. It was 2012, 3 years after my initial conversations with Yu Zhengsheng.
Mm-hmm.
And when we got the license, they came to us, representatives of the government came to us and they said, we are so happy. This is a glorious day. We get to give you this license. But then in the course of the next couple of weeks, they explained to us that, number one, the banking license didn't entitle us to do anything other than call ourselves a bank. We could open our front door and we could greet people, but we couldn't take a deposit. That required a separate license. We couldn't make a loan. That required a separate license. We couldn't change money. That required a separate license. And in fact, a bank like Silicon Valley Bank would need at least 15 different licenses to do what we do in every other country in which we operate. So that was the first thing. And they, the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese government, could issue those licenses when and if they felt like it. Though you could apply, but even qualifying didn't mean you'd get the license. It was totally up to them. And then the other thing they explained to us right after they gave us the license was they were so sorry, but there had been a rule around for 30 years, maybe, that said that any brand new bank with any foreign ownership couldn't use Chinese currency for the first 3 years. Which meant that we had 62 people we had to pay for, but we couldn't do any business for the first 3 years. And that was very, very disappointing and shocking. But what they wanted us to do was to spend those 3 years teaching other banks our business model. That's exactly what they asked us to do.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that?
Yeah,
Yeah. So as you were being informed of this rule that existed for 30 years and you couldn't use local currency for 3 years, did you have any consultants or advisors with you on how to respond to that assertion?
I did not. Perhaps foolishly, I went without consultants and advisors,
Okay.
and I learned everything on my own, so to speak. And of course, from our employees, they would share their thoughts. All of our employees, with the exception of, I think, myself and two other people, were Chinese citizens, mainland Chinese, PRC citizens. So sometimes the quality of the advice I was getting wasn't as helpful as you might wish it would be. Not because anybody wanted to deceive me, but because they didn't know how the government and the Chinese Communist Party was going to treat us. They could only guess themselves.
Right. So this was in 2008?
This was now, well, no, 2011.
2011. So let me ask you this.
We moved over.
Yeah, this is an interesting question. So since you didn't have advisors or consultants, but now you have this experience,
Yeah.
what do you think would have happened after they told you couldn't use local currency for 3 years? What do you think would have happened if you simply replied, "How can we change that?"
Oh, I did. I asked them, and different people came out of the woodwork and at relatively high levels and offered us advice. Fundamentally, as soon as I found that out at the end of 2011, our first year, I decided that I would devote my time 100% to trying to get an exception. So I mapped out the Chinese government to the extent that it was relevant to my quest to get an exception. And I figured out three paths to the top, because you almost always have to go to the top.
Right.
China is very authoritarian, and ultimately decisions roll down from the top.
Right.
The top in this case would have been Xi Jinping. Well, actually, at that point, it wasn't yet Xi Jinping. It was Hu Jintao, but subsequently it became Xi Jinping. And I mapped out my three paths, and I spent the next 3 years pursuing those paths. And people gave me encouragement for a while, and then ultimately people began saying to me, "You know what? You've worn out those paths. You're wearing out your welcome. Just drop it. You'll get the permission to use renminbi when we tell you."
Did you ever get any asks that you could not deliver on or honor? Like during this quest to accelerate the process or make an exception, were you being asked things that you could not do due to compliance or ethics or whatever?
Not directly, but indirectly.
Indirectly, people were hinting at a lot of things.
Yeah, people were thinking of a lot of things. There were people who I met who would say, "Well, you know, if you were willing to bribe people, you would probably make a lot more progress." These were Chinese advice.
Is that the main thing that you could not do due to compliance and ethical reasons? Bribe people? Is that the main ask that you could not accommodate? Or were there
the other ask that I didn't want to accommodate was teaching other banks our business model. I just felt that was unreasonable and unfair, and I could pay lip service to it, but I wouldn't actually do it.
Yeah. So is that you had talked about that in your speech? Let's get back to the inadvertent technology transfer. You were trying to explain that.
Well, fundamentally, a bank doesn't really have technology, but we do have an art, a way of doing business. After all, there are thousands of banks in the United States, and we had dominant market share for decades. which means that we developed an approach that other banks were incapable of emulating. So it wasn't the kind of thing that could be patented, but it was the kind of thing that could be copied. And they wanted us to explain that to them. And they wanted us to teach other banks how to do what we did. As a matter of fact, early on, after we'd only been there about 6 months, one day my conversation partner at our joint venture partner came to me and said, "I'm very disappointed in you. I feel you've deceived us." And I said, "What do you mean? I don't understand that. I've been completely open with you." And he said, "Because I know that you have an algorithm that you use to differentiate between startups that will succeed and those that won't. And you aren't letting us know what that algorithm is."
So this is the great story. I love this story. You shouldn't have said you don't have an algorithm.
I did. I said, "You know what? We don't, because we don't." I said, it's just hard work. I said, we have a kind of an apprenticeship approach to teaching lenders how to lend money. And when somebody joins us, they may have to work with a more senior person for as much as 10 years until we feel comfortable letting them make loans on their own. And I said, it's really pattern recognition. The people in our bank have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of startups. And over time, we develop a sort of a sixth sense. We are able to differentiate because we see patterns. And pattern recognition is something that takes years to develop and to train. And so I said, there is no algorithm. I'm sorry.
So let's do another one of those hindsight exercises. One of the things, as I'm sure you've noticed, is that Americans are too literal in their definition of truth and honesty. So
Yes.
you were being truthful and you were being honest. We don't have an algorithm.
Yeah.
But just imagine if you were Chinese and you knew if you had an algorithm that you could share, you could gain tremendous advantage.
That's right.
So what would have been the downside of just writing down what you just described as how we do it? This is our process. Putting it on a formal SVB letterhead, printing it out, and putting it into a very expensive gold leaf bound folder and said, "Okay, here it is."
You know what? There wouldn't have been any downside.
There would have been an upside, probably.
There are a number of things that I refused to do that, had I been willing to do, I probably would have made more progress, or at least there would have been no downside, because I subsequently did my best to teach the people at our joint venture partner how we did what we did. I didn't want to go to other banks. They wanted me to go to other banks too. But I did do my best to teach our joint venture partner how we do what we do. And the truth is, it wasn't something that you could copy very easily unless you were willing to put in 5 or 6 or 7 years practicing. And nobody was able to do that or wanted to do that. So there was no downside to teaching my joint venture partner.
So would you advise leaders today, executives going to China, to don't do what I did or do as I did?
I think for the most part, they should do as I did. And I say that because had we actually had real technology, I think I would have been making a huge mistake to give that to them.
Okay.
And here's what basically happens. Ultimately, in the case of many, many companies, they get cajoled into giving up their technology. Either it's an open trade, so to speak. The Chinese Communist Party says to them, "Look, you want access to our market, you've got to give up your technology." Or they say, "You know what? You want access to our market, but you've got to source 80% of the parts that you need. Let's say you're building something, you have to source it in China. So that means that you've got to teach a lot of small Chinese companies how to build the parts that you need in order to produce your product. And then later on, those companies get together and they create a Chinese competitor. And the competitor goes against you ultimately in China. And if they succeed in competing successfully against you in China, then they may go out into the wide world and compete against you in other countries. So I would be reluctant if we actually had real technology to transfer it to a company.
Were you also reluctant to pretend you had real technology?
Yeah, I didn't want to pretend. Unfortunately, I'm not a good pretender. If I were, I might have considered it. You know, the third thing I was going to mention to you when I was describing the experience in a big picture sense was 3 years later, when we reached the 3-year point and they were giving us permission to use renminbi, they basically said, you know, this is wonderful. Now you can start using renminbi. And by the way, we admire your business model so much that we've decided to copy it. And we are opening up a brand new bank in another couple of weeks right here in Shanghai. It's called Huarui Bank. And I would like you to spend a few hours with the management team, helping them to understand some aspects of your business model that they never really understood.
I hope you enjoyed that. Now, if there's any confusion about what my channel is and who it's for, it's because I had to adapt to some life changes after becoming a stay-at-home dad when my son Jaden was born. What do you say to a friend from China is my attempt to address our cross-cultural communication challenges through our next generation. And here's my first Mandarin Chinese language and cultural guide. Now, I still discuss improving our communications with counterparts in China, but now I include a younger audience. If you're interested in discussing anything China related, creating content, or recording a podcast together, you can comment on this post or contact me in the links in the description.